All right, I think we're going to get started. Hi, my name is Jan Rybnicek. I'm an adjunct professor here at George Mason University, and I'm delighted to be here. I'm a big believer that the FTC and the antitrust community more broadly should reevaluate its tools periodically and see if they measure up to the modern economic realities. We have a fantastic panel here that I'm particularly delighted to be moderating. Unlike your usual competition panels that are filled with lawyers and economists, we actually have industry specialists, though we do have both lawyers and economists as well. So we're going to hear their experiences from in the trenches, inside and alongside companies, talking about the issue, and the title of this panel is Multi-Sided Platforms in Action. So we'll get a range of views from personal experiences and hopefully a healthy discussion afterwards. Just a quick note about the structure of today's panel. We'll start with Ben Thompson, who will give a 20-minute presentation or so, and then each of the panelists will give their introductory remarks, about 10 minutes each, and then we'll open it to Q&A and discussion, including, I think, there'll be some opportunity for questions from the audience. I think you have to write it down, and those will be passed up. But there'll be about a 30-minute portion there for Q&A and discussion. So before we get any further along, let me introduce the panel. So to my right, Elizabeth Altman, who's the assistant professor at the Manning School of Business at the University of Massachusetts. Scott Kupor, who is the managing partner at Andreessen Horowitz. Roger McNamee, a managing director and co-founder of Elevation Partners. Steve Tadelis, professor of economics, business, and public policy at the Haas School at Berkeley. And then Ben Thompson, who is the founder and author of predatory. So with that introduction, I think we'll turn the mic over to Ben.
Good morning. To Jan's point, I think this presentation will be a little bit different in flavor than the ones that came before. I think, we went to there's economists here. I'm not an economist. I'm not a lawyer. I write about the tech industry, primarily focused on it from a strategic perspective. So when I am thinking and writing and talking about platforms, I'm thinking about it in the context of how and why are companies like Google and Facebook and Amazon and Apple and all the other companies that would seek to challenge them or live in a world in which they dominate, how do they make decisions, how do they make strategic choices? And so there are aspects that relate to what was talked about this morning, but hopefully more in the context of how it actually applies in real life. And what I wanted to sort of focus on in this presentation is something that I think is challenging about these issues is quite obviously, these companies are dominant. I mean, any sort of real world view and understanding of what's happening, not just in the tech industry, but in all sorts of industries broadly, it's kind of to lie to yourself to say that they're not. But per the discussion today, it's very easy to come up with arguments, particularly under the way that antitrust is traditionally thought about in the United States. How could they be dominant? There was a discussion about multi-homing in the earlier panel. You could just go to another search engine. You could just go to another social network. Yet that never seems to actually happen. And so what I want to talk about today is something that I've thought about for several years now, this idea of aggregation, where what is it that makes these companies so dominant in a world where people really could go elsewhere, yet they continue to choose to go to these same places, and how does that happen? What are the driving factors, and what are the implications of that? And if this is the case, how do we think about addressing these companies in a new sort of framework beyond sort of the traditional antitrust? I really started to think much more about this. I was also speaking earlier this year at Chicago had a similar conference about antitrust, and it was about digital platforms. And that word platforms, and I talked about how these companies are dominant. I'm going to use a couple of the same slides today, full disclosure. But I realized as the discussion went on, in part because I went first in that case and the economists came later, that this use of the word platform really stuck out to me, because platform means something. It's been used in the context of antitrust and technology, obviously in the case of Microsoft. But to my mind, what is happening with Google and Facebook is very different than what went on with Microsoft. And my concern and eagerness to sort of tease this apart is that if we take a Microsoft framework and try to apply it to Google and Facebook, one, it probably won't be successful, and two, it will lead to actually poor policy outcomes that will only entrench them and make them stronger. So just to sort of reiterate how strong these are, you don't need to look at it closely. I'm going to highlight the important parts. These are the mobile audience reach of the leading smartphone apps in the United States. And there's a whole list there. What it turns out, though, is Google has 7 of them. Facebook has 3. They have all of the top 5, and they have 8 of the top 10. So from a consumer-facing side, they are clearly very dominant. And you can see this in the share of mobile search. Google is well over 60%, has been for a long time. This actually dramatically understates it from a worldwide perspective, where they're well over 90%. And then on the meantime, on the other side is the share of time spent on social networks. And you see Facebook at the top, but you also see that other one, the dark blue one, is Instagram, which is obviously also Facebook. And this is this is projected in 2018, 2019. I think it's actually inaccurate. I would imagine Instagram has now significantly surpassed Snapchat. So I call these companies, particularly Google and Facebook, I call them aggregators. And I want to sort of explain what an aggregator is and why it is different than a platform. And I'm going to do this to go back to sort of when Google got started. It's interesting that Yahoo came up in the panel earlier, because to me, understanding how and why it is that Google beat Yahoo helps explain why it is they are so dominant today and why that dominance is only built over time. So you go back to 1994, and the internet, there's a few pages out there, a few links. I analogized it to a pile of straw, and finding a needle in straw in this size, it's pretty easy. And that's basically what Yahoo did. This is the first version of the Yahoo site. There were not that many links. Like, they literally put numbers around how many web pages there were around each particular category, because there just weren't that many. And in this sort of context, it was very easy to find results. And Yahoo went out and find the sites and make a directory. You could find what you were looking for. Within 2 years, the internet had gotten to be obviously quite a bit bigger. It was still possible to find the needle, but it was getting a lot more complex. The Yahoo, as you see in the Yahoo webpage, getting more complex, more links over time. Within a couple more years, finding a needle was really quite difficult. And Yahoo pretended like they had everything, but if you remember back in the time, it was getting more and more difficult to actually find what you were looking for. And the reality of the internet is it's actually much more like this, and good luck finding a needle here. And the problem for Yahoo is that the number of websites were increasing exponentially. But Yahoo, by virtue of its model and being a directory, was sort of fundamentally limited to sort of linear growth. And that's why the sort of performance of Yahoo as a useful portal for finding your way on the web was dramatically deteriorating over time. And to understand what made Google different is Google, instead of trying to look at all the pages, looked at all the links in between the pages. And what was so brilliant about this model is that the more pages that were on the internet, the better Google actually got. Whereas Yahoo's going the opposite direction. The more pages Yahoo got worse, the more pages Google was actually getting better. And I put web pages on here because the reality is the number of websites was what you think about a newspaper. It's adding 100 pages a day. You do this across all kinds of sites, and it was just exploding. And Google basically made, by indexing on the link and by understanding the relationship of websites and using that to rank, could basically have the whole of the internet almost within itself. And you compare this sort of homepage to that Google one, to the Yahoo one, exploding in complexity, and Google dramatically simplifying it. It was superior. I mean, I've been following technology since the 80s, or late 80s. I guess I was still a kid back then. But I've looked a lot at history, and I don't know if it's hard to imagine a more sort of dramatic, a product that was so much better from day one. It was just dramatically better, and Google won because it was better. It just crushed Yahoo. Now, the way this plays out now over time is you go back to the way information used to be distributed. And you'll be in your newspaper, be bundled together. And what made newspapers valuable back in the day is that they were a bundle. You put editorial together, you put advertising together, and what actually made a newspaper valuable was not that editorial, and not even necessarily that advertising. It was the fact that they had delivery trucks, they had printing presses, and they by controlling distribution, they were fabulously profitable entities for a very long time. Why? The hardest problem was actually getting stuff out there. The difference with the internet is distribution is effectively free. You can go to any website on any server anywhere in the world, and it's basically $0. And so the hard problem was no longer distribution, the hard problem was discovery. It was how do you find what you're looking for in just a world of abundance. And Google solved that problem, and then because they solved that problem, all the users went to Google, and then boom, they dropped advertising in front of the user in exactly where the advertiser wanted to be. The person telling them what they were looking for, and Google profited fantastically. And this is sort of the way to understand how the internet has changed. What happens when you have zero distribution costs and also zero transaction costs. Google is not limited by the number of people they can serve because, oh, 1 million people, how can we serve another million? No, again, for all intents and purposes, obviously it costs a lot to run a server and the bandwidth is expensive, but on a marginal basis, every additional user is effectively free. And so you have this idea where before the internet, distribution was the challenge. After the internet, discovery was the challenge. And you see Facebook did something very similar. Where would you connect with friends and family? Well, you might do it at school, might be your neighborhood, might be your church. And this was the way to connect to people, and that was fundamentally limited. It didn't scale. Facebook, on the other hand, lets you literally be friends with anyone, anywhere in the world, and your experience of being friends with someone next door was the exact same as your experience of being friends with someone on the other side of the globe. And then, of course, once you had all the users' attention, that's where everyone wanted to be, whether it be news, whether it be quizzes, whether it be all sorts of different content, and of course, Facebook could put ads there. And so you get to that multi-homing issue. You know, Larry Page is saying our competition is only a click away. And technically, yes, that's true. But the difference is, when you go back to these models, when all the users are on Facebook, what happens to the supply? What happens to the news media? What happens to the articles? What happens to the videos? They are all heavily motivated to get on their platform. And you see the same thing with Google in particular. I mean, my favorite example is newspapers will complain that Google is killing their business, and meanwhile, their web development folks are finely tuning their website so it will appear better on Google's results. There is an entire business called the search engine optimization business, which is basically all about making Google better. That's literally what's going on. The suppliers have no power over Google. They are heavily motivated to actually improve the Google product. And you get this sort of virtuous cycle where Google gets more users, it's more attractive to suppliers, in this case being content, who enhance their content to make it better for Google. And you see this more and more today with that Omni box. Google puts our specifications. If you're a recipe site, put it in this format. And they all hustle to put it in that format. And now Google's results are better. So more users want to go to Google. More users on Google, suppliers are more motivated to make Google better. And you have the exact same sort of thing with Facebook. And this key thing about these aggregators, is that by controlling the users, they can compel suppliers to come on their platforms at their terms. And so when you figure out over time, why would you go anywhere else? The users don't leave Google because Google is better. And Google is not just better initially, they leverage that to become better and better over time, and a similar thing with Facebook. And so these digital platforms are aggregators. This is what I said the first time. I'm going to get to the distinction in a moment. But they control demand, they deliver superior user experience. And by user experience, I just mean the UI. I mean the totality of it. What's the number one part of a user experience for a social network? It's, are your friends or family there? They pull suppliers on the platform on their terms, they benefit from scale, and they tend towards winner take all because of this virtuous cycle where more users drives more suppliers, drives more users. But again, I started to get a little unsure about this digital platforms word. Is that the right thing for our aggregators and digital platforms? Are those the same things? And I think they might be a little bit different, and this is sort of the key sort of message that I wanted to get across. A platform, if you think about it, you have third parties on the platform, you have users that are using those third-party applications. This is the Microsoft model for all intents and purposes. Think about Windows being on the bottom, think about all the applications being on top. Users both buy computers with Windows, they also buy applications to use it. And there is this, just think about the order of where they're in and compare that to the sort of aggregator, where the aggregator all this stuff is on there, it's out there, but it sort of leads you to it. And the difference is that a platform sort of facilitates a connection between the third parties and the user. You need Windows to have Photoshop on it. The user can connect with Photoshop and use that, and Windows is sort of underlying that. In the case of an aggregator, though, they are intermediating. They're standing between what the user wants and where they're going. And I think this is a slightly different structure that is very important in thinking about where their sort of market power comes from. And there's this quote, it's a little bit long, you can read it if you like, from Jonathan Palmatier when he was at Facebook, and he was bragging about, oh, we have this great platform. You know, and Bill Gates comes in and says, that's not a platform. Why is it not a platform? Because your suppliers are all screwed. They're not making any money. Facebook is harvesting everything. Whereas Windows was a platform, Windows used to brag of the totality of the Microsoft ecosystem. We only take 27%, or that's about the number that they were focused on. Because the way a platform works is you succeed when all the entities on top of your platform succeed. And I kind of coined this idea of there being sort of a Bill Gates line, where does the value in the value chain, who captures that value? And clearly compared to something like Microsoft, all the value in the Facebook and Google ecosystems is accruing to Facebook and Google. Whereas Microsoft was only taking a portion. So the AWS, very much a pure platform, I will distinguish it from Amazon, is absolutely value is going, some's going to Amazon via the AWS, via the companies that are paying for AWS, but the vast majority is going to the companies that are running on there. And I find it very difficult to say that Facebook and Google are the same sort of economic model as something like AWS or Microsoft when you see how the value is being distributed within the entire ecosystem. And so if you think about it in different ways, and there's a typo on this one, sure you will find it soon, but if you think about the difference between a platform and an aggregator, platforms have open access. Anyone can build on top of them. They have the closed technology. This is the issue that was discussed earlier. Microsoft, it was hard to sort of switch because they made it very difficult because they had this sort of closed API, which they opened up kind of, sort of, and made it very difficult to do on top of. Whereas an aggregator, their technology is wide open. It's all open source. Come and get it. You can use what you want. But the issue is that it's not about the technology. It's about where the users are. Think about third parties, you partner with the platform. You partner with Microsoft. You partner with AWS. You're on the same team. Now, obviously, there can be conflicts there, as Microsoft had conflicts with third-party applications, and Amazon has conflicts. But by and large, it's a relationship where you work together. When it comes to aggregator, your best option is to try to go around them. If you're on them, you're on their terms. You're competing with everyone else. You're totally commoditized. And then from a regulation perspective, should not be limit vertical disclosures, be limit vertical foreclosure, is important for platforms. You worry about Microsoft having Office on top of it and building things up and down and locking people in and not having competition on top of the platform. Whereas with aggregators, because the power comes from the number of users they have and the network effect they have on that side, you want to limit where they go horizontally. It's a very different sort of problem. And so when I think about what's a framework or an approach to regulating these sort of companies. And again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an economist, I'm just thinking sort of big picture strategically what makes sense. You really have to start with internet assumptions. And by that I mean start with the idea of zero marginal cost. Start with the idea of things spreading very rapidly. And right now, all the traditional companies view those as negatives, but they can be hugely powerful. So number one, you have to constrain horizontal expansion. I consider the greatest regulatory failure in the internet area is Facebook acquiring Instagram. And part of the problem was there was no really framework to say why they shouldn't be allowed to. Instagram had, 1 million users. It was a little company, about $1 billion. And everyone was like, why are they spending so much money? But Instagram was a network with network effects on the consumer side that was growing at a rate that where it is now was definitely predictable, particularly by people that were in the industry, and certainly by Facebook. That's why they paid $1 billion. And the issue really matters in this case when it comes to advertising markets. From a user perspective, Instagram is still separate from Facebook, and yes, you see your friends between the two, and you can tell there's a connection. But what really matters is from a user perspective, WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram might be separate from a user perspective. From an advertiser perspective, they're the same. And so you're an advertiser, and you think about, I want to reach young people. Facebook is no longer cool with young people. How do I reach them? Well, I could go to Snapchat. Maybe Snapchat is popular. But you know what? I'm already on Facebook. I'm already spending money on Facebook. Facebook, if I go there, I can also advertise on Instagram with very little effort, very little extra work. It's the same portal, it's the same salespeople, and it's the same ad format. You actually just do the same ad, and you can run it on both, whether that be feed ads, whether it be story ads. And this issue is that why would you bother with something like Snapchat? And so Snapchat can get 300 million users and yet be on the verge of being a failed company because they can't build an effective monetization engine because Facebook has effectively eaten their lunch. The second principle, in my mind, is really a focus on transparency. The issue with users driving the power of these platforms because they have all the users is their power will never be reduced until users decide to leave them. It's going to be very difficult to have any other sort of approach. And so I think what's been very interesting, you take something like Facebook, for example. Facebook has made dramatic changes in the last 6 months around your data and how much it's locked down and privacy. And what drove that? It was not the FTC consent decree, which was 7 years ago. They didn't really change anything, to be frank. What drove that was the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Why? Because what is far more dangerous to Facebook is not a regulatory intervention. It is users deciding, crap, I don't want to use Facebook anymore. I'm going to go somewhere else, or I'm going to cut it off. That is the real danger point for Facebook. And it sounds very stupid to say bad PR is a tool. But in a world of social media where news spreads like crazy and any story can be read by anyone in the world because it's not geographically constrained, it is actually the thing these companies fear the most. The other thing that's super important to keep in mind is not burdening challengers. If we want to have sort of competition to craft regulation, like I would argue the GDPR in Europe, that is focused on Google and Facebook and trying to catch them and become very complex, is it makes it nearly impossible to build a competitor. And in this case, simple and predictable, combined with transparency, I think is to be much more effective than complex and prescriptive, precisely because we need competitors to arise, and they can build around simple and predictive. It's very hard to build a new company around complex and prescriptive. So thank you very much. I will not leave my slide as the last one, sorry.
We're just going to go through the...
Okay, it's just going to go to the title slide. There you go. Oh, sorry.
Sorry. All right, Liz. We'll get to your stuff.
I really wanted you to see the slides twice.
Even the typo.
Nope.
Yep. There we go.
It's kind of anticlimactic since I'm not using slides.
Efficient.
Excellent. Should I start?
Yes.
Sure. Well, good afternoon. I'm Elizabeth Altman, and it is an honor and a pleasure to be here today. I've been learning all day so far, a great deal from my colleagues, and I'm looking forward to continuing the discussions. So I was asked to take a couple minutes to introduce myself and provide some context from my perspective vis-a-vis multi-sided platforms, or MSPs, and their related ecosystems. I started my career as a mechanical engineer, then realized I wanted to work at the intersection of technology and business. So I went to graduate school at MIT, completed 2 master's degrees, one in mechanical engineering and one in business, and then I went to Motorola and stayed 18 years, 9 of which as a VP, primarily focused on business development and strategy. In 2010, I returned to academia and started a doctoral program at the Harvard Business School. When I arrived at HBS, the professors kept asking me what was the most complex, difficult, or frustrating thing I had been dealing with as an executive. What was the puzzle that I really wanted to solve? So I thought about a number of challenges and realized that what was really difficult and interesting was the transition we were seeing to more open and interdependent business models. Along with new opportunities, we had new dependencies and much increased complexity. So essentially, I had been living through the challenges of a large, mature, incumbent, successful firm grappling with the transition to platform-based and ecosystem models. My dissertation, completed in 2015, was titled Platform and Ecosystem Transitions, Strategic and Organizational Challenges. Then building on that work, Professor Andre Haju and I published a Harvard Business Review article in 2017 on the opportunities and challenges for firms transitioning to platform-based businesses, as opposed to those that were born as a platform. And as a side note, I imagine we can come back to platforms, aggregators, and discussions around them. At the moment, I'm taking a broader view of platforms that I'll discuss. So in our HBR article, we present a framework with 4 specific ways in which products and services can be turned into platforms, and we look at strategic advantages and disadvantages of each approach. For the sake of time, I'll briefly explain 2 of the approaches we present, and then spend a few moments both highlighting particular challenges in hybrid organizations, and also touching briefly on considerations for firms that interact with platforms and or join their ecosystems. So first, because the terms platform and platform business are used in multiple ways, and we've already seen that today and just had that conversation, or at least heard about it, let me note that when I say platform-based business, I refer to an organization that facilitates interactions or transactions between parties. So for example, Airbnb facilitating transactions between hosts and guests, or Amazon on the marketplace side of their business connecting sellers with buyers. So the first scenario of a firm aiming to transition all or part of a business to a platform involves opening the door to third parties. In this case, a firm has a large established customer base that third-party sellers of other offerings are interested in reaching. Firm becomes a multi-sided platform by making it possible for these third parties to connect with the firm's customers. And note that this connecting can also include advertising to them. So that's where we get the ad-supported platforms as well. The third-party offerings can either be independent of the firm's product or service, or they can be products or services that work in combination, such as apps or modules that we see a lot of today. An example is Intuit, working with its QuickBooks financial accounting software product and turning it into an MSP by opening it up and allowing third parties to provide add-on modules for it. These modules or apps leverage data about small business finances to provide more functionality to QuickBooks and QuickBooks users. The connection then is between QuickBooks customers and the third parties, and it's made through Intuit's system, and thus Intuit becomes an MSP. An advantage for this strategy is that these third-party apps serve additional needs for customers that may not be served by the original product. They often fill niche gaps that the MSP doesn't intend to fill themselves. But there are, of course, potential downfalls of this approach. One is that firms start to allow others to reach their customers, but the customers may not always want to be reached through the platform. So if a firm starts to allow advertisers to interact with customers through their product, customers may not be happy about this. An issue also is that if a third-party firm fails to meet expectations for a customer, or worse, causes some significant problem, the customer may want to hold the initial firm, the now MSP, responsible. So essentially, the MSP, by enabling and facilitating transactions, implicitly endorses third parties operating on their platform. Thus, there are a variety of strategic decisions a firm must make regarding the extent to which they plan to govern or control the third parties they are enabling on their platform. We see a spectrum of curation approaches ranging from very tight control to a much more open market. And again, we can discuss that a little more in our discussion. A final consideration for firms that follow this approach is that the third parties may cannibalize the MSP's offerings. So very basically, when Amazon initially allowed other booksellers to sell through their marketplace offering, they were essentially enabling competitors to compete with them. And this is the trade-off associated with making the MSP itself more attractive to a greater number of customers. The second scenario for creating an MSP involves connecting customers. In this case, a firm is already selling a product or service to 2 distinct sets of customer segments. These customer segments also interact with each other, but outside the firm's products. Thus, there's an opportunity to create an MSP that connects the customers. Sticking with the Intuit example, Intuit sells QuickBooks to both customers, end users, small businesses, and accountants. Intuit has worked to add a matchmaking function within QuickBooks to enable small businesses to contact and contract with accountants. The pairs can then exchange data easily through the product. Like in the first scenario, one of the potential disadvantages of this scenario is that a firm may waste resources building a matchmaking function only to find out that the customers do not want to make the matches through the platform or through the MSP. And again, if customers perceive the matchmaking to be misaligned with their core use of the original product or service, that will turn them away. And again, like in the first scenario, if one party becomes dissatisfied with the service of the other, the MSP then may be held accountable. In both these scenarios and others, the firm also maintains all or part of its traditional business. So these transitions are often partial, and we often oversimplify when we talk about platform transitions. We don't usually see firms moving entirely to platform-based businesses or entirely to interacting with platform businesses, but rather moving part of a business in that direction or entering a new business within a platform business model. Thus, we also see challenges related to operating in hybrid business models. These may cause internal difficulties. For example, one part of the business may be actively competing with another firm, while another part of the business may be enabling the growth of that same firm. Similarly, to measure performance of a platform business, a firm might want to adopt different types of metrics and hold one part of the firm accountable for different performance. So for a platform, for example, metrics might include more transaction or engagement-centric types of measures. We're also just starting to fully understand organizational and leadership challenges associated with these transitions. For example, whereas a product firm might primarily reward engineers and designers who create innovative new solutions or patents, an MSP might need to focus more heavily on rewarding people who engage externally and build large communities, generating growth through network effects. And finally, while many firms are transitioning businesses to platforms, even more organizations are now in a position where they need to interact with platform ecosystems, whether or not they become a platform themselves. Ranging from simply having a smartphone or tablet app through selling products via platforms, firms are addressing strategic questions associated with joining ecosystems, or in many cases, becoming complementers. I mentioned Airbnb earlier as a platform. An interesting discussion, for example, is how Marriott is and should be interacting with Airbnb. On one hand, they're clearly competitors going after the same customers. On the other, they're complementers. Marriott now lists rooms and vacation properties on Airbnb, so Airbnb is serving as a distribution mechanism. If an MSP like Airbnb or others changes its requirements or business models, that may have a large effect on the ecosystem of complementers around it. So there are dependencies that are created in these interactions. In the case of Airbnb and Marriott, they're both very large businesses, both large firms at this point. However, often these interactions involve asymmetries of size and power, and that causes other sets of challenges. We're really just starting to refine our understanding of these dependencies and interdependencies that are created in these systems. So I'll leave it there for now. Thank you again for including me in the panel, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you. Thanks for this, Steve.
Okay, I guess I'm next. Thank you again for including me as well. What I'm going to do is I'm going to focus more on marketplaces as a particular form of platforms. And the reason that's important for me is because you hear a lot of people talking about platforms as if they all share something deeply in common, and therefore the same approach or the same methodologies or the same kind of analyses are going to be well suited to address all kinds of problems or lack thereof across different kind of platforms. And I think it's important to realize that the devil's in the details, and we're using this word very loosely. I have nothing against definitions, but we're struggling defining platforms, adding something like another definition, aggregators, and now we're going to have to start asking ourselves what's exactly an aggregator. And I think that it was useful to hear the conversation discussion earlier in the morning, which echoed starting with Mark Reisman and through Joe Farrell, that we're really talking about a continuum here, and how many network effects are there, and how strong is it? How much of a strategy is this vis-a-vis multi-sided platforms and so on? So going into online marketplaces in particular, where I think it's a little clearer to see the exact business model, then we just have to go back to 1995, right, almost 25 years ago, and that was Craigslist and eBay, right? They really were the first marketplaces online. Before those, you had online bulletin boards, not too different from the older version of BlaBlaCar that Joe referred to as bulletin boards to get shared rides. But what Craigslist and eBay did, they made it a lot easier for people to interact. Of course, one, Craigslist was very much replacing ads in newspapers, the classifieds, and it was a very local market. eBay took it to a national and even a global level. And if you ask what the business model was, it was relatively straightforward. It's connecting buyers and sellers. It's creating gains from trade and grabbing a commission on that gains from trade, much more eBay than Craigslist. As I'm sure you know, Craigslist only charges for a sliver of the ads that people list on Craigslist. So if you think about the incentives of a marketplace business, I think that in order to do their business successfully, they really have to internalize the externalities that happen on these marketplaces. And in particular, it's about facilitating and maintaining a level of trust. So if you think of the fact that you have thousands, if not millions of sellers and millions of buyers on each side of these markets, then if at some point in time one of these parties feels that they were short-shrifted or screwed in any way, they're not thinking, oh, I just bought this pair of jeans on eBay from Joe Schmo Jeans, and I was not happy with the transaction, so mental note, don't go to Joe Schmo Jeans again, but eBay is fantastic. No, what people are thinking is, wait, I bought this through eBay, I'm not happy with eBay. And in fact, there's some research that I did with a colleague who used to be at eBay with me when I was there, where we took data from eBay at the consumer level, very granular, and we're able to prove in no uncertain terms that when someone is harmed by a transaction in any way of dissatisfaction, the impact that that really has is abandoning the site much more than just abandoning a particular seller. So marketplaces that understand that business model clearly have to invest in helping maintain a level of quality, which then, of course, means that they have to monitor, they have to find ways of measuring the quality of transactions, and they have to have carrots and sticks to incentivize sellers to do the right thing. The tools they will use, for example, are feedback mechanisms that everybody's familiar with, right? The reputation of a seller, and eBay started that, and now it's commonplace on practically every marketplace. Using search, for example, to demote or promote sellers that they believe are doing a better job, and so on. So there's a very important tool that these marketplaces are using in order to create that trust and facilitate the trade that really comes from having a trustworthy marketplace. Now, when we think about that, then, okay, now I'm a marketplace, I'm putting together these tools, I'm creating these externalities, and I'm internalizing them. Well, does that necessarily mean that we're going to have a convergence towards one large firm, market size, that's going to be protected by barriers to entry and lack of entry? Well, the common argument really is that there are these strong network effects, okay, or the chicken and egg problem, that once a marketplace is established, another one will have trouble. But here I'm echoing again a term that came up in the morning, the issue of multi-homing. If anyone is talking about platforms, online marketplaces, et cetera, and not talking about multi-homing, you're leaving out one of the most important aspects of the evolution of these markets. If you think about, Catherine Tucker earlier had this nice slide where you saw a car with an Uber sticker and a Lyft sticker. Well, if I pull out my iPhone, you'll see the Uber app and the Lyft app right next to each other. And the reason is that unless I'm doing a $5 ride, which I'll sometimes do, within 40 seconds, I'm going to check both of those apps, and I will see both the price and how long it's going to take the driver to come. Right? And I know a lot of people that do it. I always ask drivers, oh, are you just driving exclusively before one or the other? A majority of drivers, and this is also well documented, do both. Multi-homing is very easy. Now think about sellers. Every major seller on eBay is listing on Amazon, and many of them will have their own website. So you have these sellers and buyers trying out all these places because the cost of engaging in multi-homing for most of these is very small. It's not like it was with the railroads where there was no alternative to the monopolist railroad that owned the tracks. So if you think about the evidence on entry, well, let's go back to 1995, but actually let's look at Craigslist today. That's what the Craigslist website looks like today. Now, I don't know how many people here have used Craigslist over the years, but if you have, you know that the website looked the same way 5 years ago and 10 years ago and basically 20 years ago. And this is a meme, if you will, that's very popular among VCs in the Valley because it takes Craigslist, and for many of the subcategories on Craigslist, it then points at companies that were founded and got VC funding and are profitable companies just by coming in and specializing in one of the many sub-markets that Craigslist has. And if you think about, I see Redfin there, which I used recently when I bought a home. Well, you have Redfin, and you have Zillow, and you have Trulia, and you just have so much competition across all these different niches because it's not rocket science. And really what's going on here is Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 9, there's nothing new under the sun. Right? These ideas go back to medieval times when you had trade fairs, and you had a central place where people would come to buy and sell. And to enhance that, you had some central authority that really kept track of history in order to say, oh, this person cheated before, watch out, don't interact with them again, and so on and so forth. So you see, Uber and Lyft, Airbnb and HomeAway and Upwork and TaskRabbit, and all these are reincarnations of the eBay model in particular, because Craigslist really did focus more locally. You have multi-homing, you have innovation, and the maybe exception, some might argue as well, Facebook and Google are really different because they're not marketplaces. Well, maybe, okay, the devil's in the details, but let's talk about social networks. Some people here might remember MySpace or Friendster. They're dead, and will Facebook die in a year? Maybe, because it would be so easy to transfer your friends over to another platform. Now, if Facebook is going to continue making it easy and trustworthy and so on, you won't have an incentive to do that. And if there are 2 more Cambridge Analyticas, I'm pretty sure that that will happen. When you think about search, well, I remember when I switched from Lycos to Google around 1999, and it was just because Google was better. And if tomorrow a company is going to pop up called Schmoogle, and they'll be better than Google, I'm going to switch to Schmoogle, because all I care about is having efficient and effective search. So the natural question, but before that, why didn't eBay do everything? Well, eBay didn't do everything because this is what innovation is all about. They didn't see their model as everything. Because if they did, then they would have launched Uber, and they would have launched Airbnb, and they would have launched TaskRabbit back in 1998 and 2002 and so on and so forth. But they didn't, and others did. And those who didn't do it well, were replaced by others who did it even better. So I think understanding the ease of entry and the multi-homing is very critical to understand the strength of competition in these markets. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me to participate in this hearing. My name is Roger McNamee. Since 1982, I have been an analyst of and investor in America's technology industry, with a particular focus on Silicon Valley. In the 1980s at T. Rowe Price Associates, I managed the top-ranked science and technology fund. In 1991, I co-founded the first crossover fund, combining public market investments with venture capital inside Kleiner Perkins, Caulfield & Byers. In 1999, I was lucky enough to co-found the first technology buyout fund, Silver Lake Partners. And in 2004, I co-founded Elevation Partners, a venture and private equity fund that invested at the intersection of technology and media. Through Kleiner Perkins, I was an early investor in Google and Amazon. At Elevation, I made early investments in Facebook and was at one time a mentor to Mark Zuckerberg. I'm a capitalist by nature and training, but I believe America's technology industry is experiencing a giant market failure. Monopolies have developed at the heart of the industry that threaten the country's leadership in technology and are undermining a key segment of the entrepreneurial economy. I believe that Ben Thompson's introduction here was fantastic. He is a brilliant analyst, and his aggregation theory advanced my understanding of how data-driven, two-sided markets with network effects operate, especially in the absence of constraints such as government regulation. For three companies, Alphabet, Amazon, and Facebook, the economics of aggregation theory have produced harmful side effects on competition, innovation, democracy, and national security. While consumer regulation would be best, which is to say consumers altering their behavior, the absence of alternatives makes that option unrealistic for these three companies. I believe antitrust action is the best and most pro-growth remedy available. And given our limited time today, I will focus my remarks on Alphabet and Facebook. I hope at another time to be able to present my concerns about Amazon. Now, most multi-sided markets are transactional, with both the buyer and the seller interacting directly, as would be the case with eBay. The market maker facilitates a transaction to the benefit of both the buyer and the seller. The economic value of the market maker's services can be priced for all participants. Traditional two-sided markets tend to lead to monopoly or oligopoly at the level of the market platform itself. But to date, policymakers and courts have not found unacceptable harm to consumers. But with data-centric internet companies like Alphabet and Facebook, two-sided markets operate differently. In these cases, the middleman interacts directly with the buyer and seller while largely blocking the buyer and seller from interacting directly, precisely as Ben described. One resulting difference is that the consumer-facing side is not explicitly transactional and is not priced in dollars. Instead, Alphabet and Facebook operate on a barter system with consumers, trading a variety of services for personal data. Both corporations rely on selling advertising to survive. Data is the essential input to their business, so they have each designed systems to gather all the consumer data they can get. They then use this data to create barriers to entry for competitors, barriers to exit for users, and to undermine the business models of content suppliers. Historically, advertising-based businesses had a one-size-fits-all broadcast model. Alphabet and Facebook transformed media by implementing a real-time, one-on-one relationship with each user. Smartphones transformed that relationship further by making it available at times and in places earlier generations of media could never reach. Each company began with a single data set, but built their economic dominance by combining data sets. Consider the case of Alphabet's Google subsidiary. It began with search-based ads. A consumer in the market for a hammer would search on Google, receive 3 AdWords from vendors of hammers, and buy from one of them. Everyone won in that transaction. The consumer got a hammer, the vendor made a sale, and Google got paid for an ad. Google's insight was that additional data sets would make its data geometrically more valuable. Combining search-based purchase intent data with identity from Gmail and real-time location from Google Maps enabled Alphabet to achieve a holy grail of advertising value that could not be replicated by traditional media or even by Amazon, which only knows the delivery location. Facebook has executed a similar strategy, but with an integrated walled garden product. The success of Alphabet and Facebook raises a broad range of issues for policymakers, especially in the realm of antitrust. Each data set they acquire increases their advantage, not only relative to competitors, but also suppliers. To understand, consider how they grew to dominance. Each offered users a bundle of incredibly convenient, notionally free services, an offering that has proved to be irresistible to users. By aggregating the audience, Alphabet and Facebook forced content providers onto their platforms on their economic terms. The result is that Alphabet and Facebook have captured an increasing percentage of the advertising value of content produced and owned by other people. This might be excusable if Alphabet and Facebook added value to that content or increased the economic pie. Unfortunately, they do just the opposite. The algorithms and business model of Facebook and Alphabet prioritize trending over substance, undermining the business model of news, video, music, and other high-value and high-cost forms of content. They are not reducing unit demand for this content, but they have disintermediated the economic value. When companies like Alphabet and Facebook combine data sets, they often discover new use cases that were unknown at the time users offered their personal data. Users are not aware of the new use cases, and so far as I can discern, often do not benefit from them. In some instances, as with the recent hacks of Facebook and Google, they can suffer great harm. The current model of antitrust regulation provides a safe harbor for Alphabet and Facebook because consumers do not pay for their services with currency. For policymaker, the exchange of services for data should raise several questions. If we were to view data as a currency, how has the price of the consumer transaction changed over time in nominal terms and relative to value received? How has the value received by Alphabet and Facebook changed relative to the benefit delivered? How has the accumulation of consumer data changed the opportunity for competitors and suppliers who transact with Alphabet and Facebook? Now, Ben Thompson's user regulation framework would have been perfect had we known what we know now before Alphabet and Facebook expanded horizontally and acquired their most threatening rivals. The situation calls, I believe, for greater intervention. My hypothesis is that the algorithms and business models of Alphabet and Facebook have harmed suppliers, competitors, and users in ways which, if data were viewed as a currency, would violate antitrust laws. While not the subject of this hearing, I believe Alphabet and Facebook routinely violate the FTC's consumer protection mandate, and those violations are central to the violations of antitrust law. Alphabet and Facebook are unusually opaque to advertisers, users, and regulators, and I hypothesize that that opacity has enabled them to change the effective economic terms of every business relationship without the knowledge of the other party. In the context of the economy and society, the consequences of the concentrated economic power of Alphabet and Facebook are many and increasingly destructive. By compounding network effects, Alphabet and Facebook have created massive zones where entrepreneurs and venture capitalists will not enter. They have also acquired and invested in promising next-generation technologies like artificial intelligence and virtual reality, distorting the entrepreneurial incentives in those categories. They're able to choke off capital in emerging segments, and in at least one case, were able to purchase a promising startup at a bargain price. Even successful startups are not immune, as we can observe in the case of Snap. Alphabet and Facebook have co-opted much of the venture capital industry by sharing just enough economic value to keep the peace. Now, the pendulum of technology normally oscillates between centralized and edge-centric architectures, as that has proved to be the optimal way to grow the functionality of the network and create economic growth. Thanks to the market power of Alphabet and Facebook, that pendulum is pegged to an extreme form of centralization, where by now we should have seen massive investment in new technology at the edge of the network to address the increasingly obvious flaws of the cloud model. The massive hacks and data leaks that are revealed every week are the inevitable result of this centralized model. The only decentralized model that has attracted capital, what is known as the blockchain, is struggling to find use cases because the most valuable ones are dominated by monopolists who are determined to bend it to satisfy their own needs. Against this backdrop, entrepreneurs and venture capitalists have been forced into less promising categories, like cryptocurrency, scooters, and what I call services your mother used to provide, like delivering food to your home. The effect of this is that for the first time in 60 years, the country is relying on monopolists for innovation. This is demonstrably suboptimal. Consider the risk for national security. Are we better off entrusting the development of artificial intelligence to a handful of monopolists or to a much larger set of competitors? The question takes greater salience when one considers the monopolists in question have demonstrated a desire to do business with our likely strategic challengers on whatever terms are imposed by those countries. We're a country that prospers when 1,000 flowers are allowed to bloom. We need antitrust intervention to clear fertile ground for those flowers to grow. Thank you.
Great. Great. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. By way of background, my name is Scott Kupor. I'm the managing partner for AH Capital Management, which manages approximately $7 billion in venture capital funds, focused principally on early-stage IT investments. I'm also the managing partner for CNK Capital Management, which is a registered investment advisor that manages a $350 million venture capital fund dedicated to investing in crypto-related technologies. I'd like to make 3 points today related to the topics at hand. First, while it is true that many of the companies today that we're talking about do enjoy very strong market positions, I believe that their value as potential distribution platforms to the technology community, and in particular to the pace of new startup investment, remains very important and in many ways is actually pro-competitive. Second, these large players play a significant role as acquirers of venture-backed startup companies, which is an important part of the overall health of the venture ecosystem. And thirdly, where startups have concern about the potential market power of these institutions, the free market actually works very well in addressing those concerns. I will use the rise of crypto networks as an example of such a well-functioning free market response to incumbency concerns. Let's start with the distribution platform issue. Prior to the existence of these large consumer platforms, it was very difficult for consumer startups to cost-effectively build a customer base. This is among the reasons why many of the early consumer internet-based startups in the late to mid-1990s failed. It was simply too expensive for them to acquire customers directly, and the economic rents that they could ultimately earn from these customers was too small to be able to recoup those costs. The internet was simply too nascent, and the number of customers to whom they could ultimately market their services was severely limited. If you fast forward to the past 7 to 10 years of consumer-related startup activity, we've had an unprecedented amount of new and successful large company formation. As examples, we've seen the creation of a whole new set of multi-billion-dollar companies delivering significant consumer utility, including Airbnb, Pinterest, Uber, Lyft, Instacart, Snapchat, and Lime, among others. These companies, of course, benefited from the virtual ubiquity of the internet, itself supported by the commercialization of smartphones by Apple and Samsung, among others, which drove an enormous increase in the available market size. But they also benefited from the customer acquisition channels available to them from the many other large platform providers that are today the subject of these discussions: Google, Facebook, Amazon, and of course, Apple. That is, to acquire customers, these startups did not have to go to the expense of building out massive new sales channels, but rather they leveraged the advertising and search platforms of these large incumbents. This meant a lower cost of customer acquisition and a pay-as-you-grow model for increasing advertising and customer acquisition costs, depending on a company's stage of development, ultimately providing an attractive model for entrepreneurs and venture capitalists to fund experimentation in the startup world. It's the existence of these platforms that in many ways explains the significant growth we've seen in the last 7-10 years in consumer startup and VC financing activity. Simply put, the math works. Companies can experiment with customer acquisition via these channels and fund their marketing campaigns iteratively based on which yields the highest return on capital. Without these platforms, I would venture that the economics of customer acquisition might be cost prohibitive for most startups, and thus that the venture capital committee would shift its investment into other more cost-effective areas. Now, to be fair, there are times where too much platform risk can create problems for companies. That is where complete dependency on these third-party platforms can impact a business. Zynga, for example, ran into this problem with Facebook in that it became wholly reliant on Facebook as its sole customer acquisition mode and failed to establish a direct relationship with its customers over time. The successful startups that I mentioned recognize this and utilize these platforms as mechanisms to jumpstart or bootstrap their initial customer acquisition approaches, understanding that over time they need to build direct relationships with customers to mitigate the risks of long-term dependence on these platforms. Let's turn to the important role of the platform companies in the M&A environment. The VC business, as you know, is a very high-risk one. We basically fund companies at their earliest inception with the understanding that most of these companies will not yield significant economic value. In fact, about 40 to 50% of what we invest in fails, meaning that the companies have little to no remaining economic value. About 25 to 30% of what we fund turns into small returns. The companies build something of value, but don't ultimately grow into what we hope would be the larger market potential. And finally, a small minority of what we fund turns into large opportunities that either exist as standalone public companies or are sold for significant economic returns to larger players. We know and understand this risk, of course, but nonetheless require that a small number of companies have to yield high returns on capital to make the ultimate venture business succeed. To that end, about 15 to 20 years ago, the venture and business enjoyed what we call liquidity events, which is basically the ability to convert an investment into a real economic return in the form of about 50% IPOs and 50% M&A activity. Today, that math is closer to about 80% M&A and about 20% IPOs. The reasons for this are beyond the scope of this hearing, but this trend plays a very important role in the potential actions that the Commission might be considering with respect to the large platform players in this industry. In full disclosure, we as a firm have been the beneficiary of acquisitions in our portfolio from some of these players. As examples, we were part of the investing group that sold both Instagram and Oculus to Facebook, and we've been parties to transactions with Google as well. But it's important to understand the important role that M&A does play in the venture ecosystem. As venture capitalists, we raise money from institutional investors who seek a high return on their investment and want to be able to recycle these investment returns into long-term portfolio venture assets. To do this, we need to provide them liquidity in the form of cash returns from either M&A events or IPOs. As the number of IPOs has shrunk considerably, down about 50 to 60% in the last 15 to 20 years relative to long-term median values, and as the time to IPO has significantly elongated, now about 10 to 13 years from founding of a company versus a long-term median of about 6.5 to 7 years, the role that IPOs play in providing liquidity continues to shrink. As a result, M&A continues to grow in importance to the well-functioning of the ecosystem. It provides much-needed liquidity to the institutional investors, who then use that liquidity to re-up their venture capital investments. Policies that could impact the timing or available of M&A could do meaningful damage to the capital flows in the venture business, particularly at a time where the capital markets remain a much delayed and smaller exit opportunity for venture-backed companies. Finally, I'd like to turn to the role of the free market in addressing potential competitive concerns related to the platform providers. We believe that in many ways the growth of what we call crypto networks is in part a response to the developer community's concerns about too much reliance on large platforms for customer acquisition. We don't think it's an accident that at the same time U.S. policymakers are holding hearings to discuss potential concentration in the technology industry, that we see the increasing growth of venture capital investment and new company formation in the crypto networks industry. Why is that? Recall I mentioned earlier that successful companies leverage platforms to bootstrap their customer acquisition efforts, but over time develop ways to control their own destinies. They don't want to be over-reliant on the platforms for the long term, as the platforms may change their business practices. By the way, in perfectly fair and legal ways in most cases, that could favor or disfavor certain other participants in the network. This potential risk is one that many companies seek to mitigate. Enter crypto networks. We define the term crypto networks, as a new way to build digital services, and a digital service can be effectively any internet-based application, where those services are owned and operated by a community of network participants rather than a centralized corporation, and where the repository of activity on the network, essentially the database of activity, is decentralized and maintained by the broader community. The value of crypto networks thus are manifold. First, they provide a platform on which new companies can be built without the attendant concerns that may come from relying wholly on centralized platforms. That is, decentralization and transparency ensures a more transparent governance model and allows the very startups who build on these platforms to be active members of the platform's governance. Second, crypto networks provide a symbiotic economic relationship between the value of the network itself and the work that is done by those who govern and manage the network via the introduction of a network-specific token. Tokens, in this regard, perform a series of functions. They are the method for value exchange between network participants. That is, consumers pay for services using the token, and sellers receive tokens in exchange for services. And two, they provide the financial incentive to reward developers and other maintainers of the network. That is, people may receive tokens for ensuring the authenticity and integrity of transactions completed on the network. I bring all this up not to laud the value of crypto networks themselves, but rather to use them as a very real and current articulation of the role that free markets play in reacting to perceived market challenges. That is, to the extent that developers perceive the platforms to be more powerful than they might otherwise wish, crypto networks are a potential free market solution to that perception. In other words, it may not require new government regulation or changes to existing regulations to address changes in a very progressive and fast-changing technology market. Rather, the industry has a way of remedying perceived changes through the operations of economic self-interest. Interestingly, there is an exact parallel in the enterprise community that mirrors what we've seen on the consumer platform side of the world. In the early 2000s, many commentators thought that market power and consolidation among the large enterprise players, companies like Microsoft, IBM, Cisco, and Oracle, et cetera, could create anti-competitive behavior and consumer disutility. And in many ways, the concerns were identical to those being expressed today. These large organizations controlled access to customers, akin to the consumer platforms today, in a way that made it difficult for new entrants to offer competitive solutions to those very same customers. The customers in those cases were the centralized buyers of enterprise IT solutions, namely the chief information officer, who controlled IT budgets and thus dictated the adoption or not of new technologies. Again, however, the free market solved the perceived concentration problem through development of new technology. In particular, the development of cloud computing democratized access to technology in the enterprise, enabling point solutions to be adopted by individual departments versus the tops-down adoption of technology from centralized IT organizations. As access to the technology itself democratized, so too did access to budget dollars to produce this technology, thus defeating the centralized budget control of the CIO and in turn reducing the power of incumbent IT providers. It is this broad shift in the underlying technology that has given rise to a whole new generation of IT providers, such as Salesforce.com, Workday, Splunk, ServiceNow, Box, among others. It goes without saying the free market does not always work, and the role of government regulation remains an important one to remedy such market functions. But particularly in a market as fast-moving as technology, we should exercise caution in supplanting the ability of the free market to react appropriately by developing new government regulations. In many cases, government regulations can have unintended consequences. In particular, regulation can have the opposite effect by providing more market power to the incumbents, as they are often the only ones who can absorb the costs of regulations. Startups inevitably are at a disadvantage in such circumstances, as venture capitalists won't finance new businesses where the incumbents have perceived regulatory advantages in the form of unlimited compliance resources. Barriers to funding new companies that may in fact help produce competition for market incumbents not only has economic losses from the lack of new job formation, but will also calcify market control for incumbents. Such risks are particularly acute today given the global opportunities for startup development and the ability of foreign governments to utilize pro-startup policies to attract new investment. 20 years ago, the U.S. had about a 90% market share of venture capital dollars. Today, that's just above 50%, as foreign governments continue to seek to attract startups through development of pro-entrepreneurship policies, taxes, immigration, and regulatory light frameworks. Capital is indeed highly fluid globally, and thus we need to be careful that well-intentioned regulatory policies don't disadvantage U.S. startups to the benefit of foreign domiciled competitors. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and look forward to answering your questions.
Thanks, Scott. All right. So with that, we'll open it up for Q&A and discussion. Maybe I'll just initially allow anybody who wants to respond to anything that they've heard. I know, Ben, you've been taken off the podium for a while after your presentation. I don't know if there's any reactions you have to the presentations after yours.
I think the thing that just is very clear is, both Steve and I discussed this, is the importance of distinguishing between these different markets and issues. The issues that come with Google and Facebook, I think, are clearly one category. Marketplaces is another category, and I thought Roger articulated well that the fact there is you can articulate exactly what the transaction is, how much it costs, solves a whole lot of problems. And I think the goal that the issue with Google and Facebook is one, it's not just a two-sided marketplace, it's a three-sided marketplaces with content suppliers, users, and advertisers. And that results in a very opaque sort of marketplace because the users are not aware, they are the most, that's what's valuable is their attention, and they're not party or aware of what transaction is going on otherwise. And so it's very hard to initiate any movement among consumers because there's a lack of information.
Are there any other reactions to the other presentations? Anybody would like to share?
Dig into questions.
All right. So on the issue, we've heard a number of definitions of what a platform is or what a multi-sided platform is, and whether or not there's a continuum or if it's just clear cut or who knows, maybe it's just a you know it when you see it test. Elizabeth, I don't know if you this is an area where you spend a lot of time. I don't know if you want to delve into that question a little bit more about how you see platforms and how you define them, particularly hybrid platforms potentially.
Sure. I mean, I think we've already today spent a good deal of time on this topic, and I think, so as I said, I think that the word platform, I guess maybe where I diverge a little bit from Ben is that I think, Ben, I noted, said platform means something. I think part of our problem is platform means a lot of things, and many of which are related, but not all of which are related, and I don't think we have, as a community, at least amongst academics, and I would say probably also attorneys, economists, and economists within academics, we haven't come to kind of a solid agreement of what we mean. So when I look at platforms, I look at it more broadly as, again, so technology platforms are often the base, right? And often we're talking about the software or the system or the algorithms that are at the base. And then we think about the platform-based businesses that those technology platforms enable. So generally speaking, when I think about platforms, I'm talking about them in terms of the organization or the firm or a subset of a firm that is facilitating or enabling transactions amongst players. So it's a simple way to kind of separate out. And so in that case, aggregators do fall within that broader definition. And yes, I think there are differences. I was having a conversation the other day, the difference between transaction-based platforms, again, which came up this morning, and ad-supported platforms. I don't think anyone brought up conflicts of interest and how they kind of come up in these conversations. So in transaction platforms, generally speaking, you have less concern with conflicts of interest. But in ad-supported networks, and we heard kind of the manifestation of that here in some of the comments, right? You end up with conflicts of interest by nature of the platform because the platform needs to take the data and then sell the data. And that's not always in the best interest and often isn't in the best interest of all the users on the platform. So I think that's an important distinction to think about. And again, it is and the devil is in the details. And I think it depends from what perspective you're looking at the platforms and kind of why you care, which question you're trying to answer about platforms. So I'm not sure if that clarifies or muddies the water, but
Does anybody else want to weigh in on the kind of the significance of transaction-based platforms versus ad-supported platforms and the implications of that for competition policy?
So I do want to say something along these lines of, like you said, do you know it when you see it?
Uh-huh.
I wonder how many people here in the audience had an experience that I had many times in my life where I was in a supermarket and I walked up to someone stocking the shelves to ask them where I could find, the chocolate powder or whatever. And they'll turn to me and say, sorry, I don't work here. I work for Coca-Cola, or I work for Pepsi, or I work for Nabisco, and I'm just filling the shelves. Clearly, if you think of a supermarket where they take shelf space and they say, Coca-Cola, you have this much shelf space, you decide how many Diet Cokes and how many Cokes and how many Coke Zeros you're going to put on there. In what way is that not a platform? So it really is murky, and I think the most important thing as an economist is if you're concerned about a certain anti-competitive behavior, what is your theory of harm, right? What is your understanding of the business model? What is your understanding of the interaction with consumers and other players? And what is your theory of harm? If your theory of harm is, this looks big, big makes me feel uncomfortable, something needs to be done, that's a problem.
So one of the things that we have heard is a key feature of platforms is the network effects and scale and the tendency to go to large scale and winner-take-all models. I was interested in the reaction to, I think Ben brought up the Facebook, Instagram transaction, and in light of kind of the benefits of network effects and potentially a winner-take-all model and the benefits that accrue to consumers from that. How should we think about that? And in particular, if you think that these types of horizontal acquisitions might end up harming consumers or dampen competition, how should we think about those two kind of points that are in tension? Anybody?
Well, I mean, I think if you start with the premise that the power in these value chains comes from controlling consumer demand, then it points to the issue of it being able to expand horizontally is by definition going to increase their power in the value chain. The other thing too is the scale that these companies are operating on. It's very difficult to look back historically and make, well, it happened before. I mean, you mentioned MySpace and Friendster. MySpace peaked at 75 million users. I mean, Friendster peaked at 8 million users. I mean, Instagram is probably at 8 million users today. And so the level of, it's just, to your point about the economic harm, saying big is bad, I absolutely agree with it. To the extent there's economic harm, I suspect you have to look on the advertiser side to see what is happening there with pricing. But the other point is I do think there is to use a problematic cliche, is that it actually is different this time, and different in the context of being able to scale to literally billions of users. That is and then to add the transformative effect of not just data from the users directly, but data from multiple sources. And this is where I kind of push back on the like, well, how much is your data worth to Facebook? That's actually very difficult because Facebook, from an economic perspective, adds tremendous value to user data. The data that Facebook gets from you is worth very little if you could give that to any other company. But once Facebook combines that with all the other data they get and then has the scale on the advertising side to take advantage of that, it is a massive, meaningful economic difference where Facebook is really adding tremendous value and is appropriately valued because of that. And so I do think there is an aspect here. And again, I totally agree with the theory of the issue of defining the theory of harm and the issue of just saying it's different. And my hope is with all the folks in this room to see if this can be calculated, and freely admitting that I'm not the one to do that.
There's a second element. I very strongly agree with Ben's framing of those points. The one thing I would observe is that these issues at the scale these companies operate at cannot be viewed as only about markets and only about economics. Facebook operates 2.2 billion Truman shows. And between Facebook and Google and the use of filter bubbles, they have changed the public square really dramatically. So their form of market power has implications that we've never seen previously. So my observation is the issue isn't just how big they are. It's what they do with that scale and how they change the public square, how they change the economy. And what, when you look at this as a regulator, one of the questions you're asking in this whole thing is the economy better or worse off for the changes that have come with the success of this company? And to my mind, from the FTC's perspective, the scale isn't the problem per se. It's what they're doing with it, and it's how they got there. And again, it's not just about antitrust. There is also material misrepresentations to almost every constituency they deal with. And, so there's a lot of harm. From the FTC's point of view, this is like the beginning of a whole new era because you've never previously had, I believe, a case which hit both of the FTC's mandates in the same companies at the same time. And these things are intrinsically baked together. And again, I'm a capitalist. I would normally not be sitting here arguing against the success of companies in the industry that I invest in, companies that I personally have been invested in. But the harm that's taking place to the public square, the harm that's taking place to the structure of the economy is real. And with all due respect to the crypto guys, that is not the same, that to me doesn't feel like as good a use of capital from the point of view of the country. As putting people to work, creating jobs, creating infrastructure. And that's not what these companies do.
So on that point, I'd be interested in hearing from Scott and Roger about what has happened to venture capital funding over the last 10 years, 5 years, 2 years, what we're seeing. Are we seeing money or funds being diverted from these areas? We obviously there was this The Economist article that talked about kill zones around these major platforms. There have been other studies and discussions in that space. Can you speak from your experience, what you're seeing on the ground with respect to funding and whether or not it's being diminished, diverted, and if that's actually a good or bad thing?
Sure, I'll start and give Roger an opportunity as well. So if you look at it from a raw numbers perspective, venture capital funding this year actually will hit kind of at least a 10-year, if not almost 20-year high. So we're on pace to invest more than $100 billion in the industry. Now, a lot of that money, to be fair, is happening kind of in the later stages, so it's a little bit related to the comment I made earlier about the elongation of companies staying private and effectively kind of later stage private money really supplanting what would otherwise be public money. But in terms of overall dollars investment, if you look at dollars into the industry in terms of the amount of money that LPs are funding, we'll probably eclipse $40, $45 billion this year in the U.S., which is also certainly a 10-year high. So I think from a macro perspective, it's very healthy, at least in terms of kind of dollar flows. I do agree, and I think I referenced it earlier, that there are there are implications, obviously, of the success of the platforms that do impact venture financing. So, it's unlikely that you would find a lot of early-stage venture capitalists who would fund a purely ad-supported, consumer, social business today, just given that obviously they understand certainly the kind of reliance and the market power that some of these other organizations have. On the other hand, as I mentioned, I think if you look at the growth of other platforms and other marketplaces, a lot of them were jump-started or bootstrapped based upon kind of the existence of those platforms as relatively cost-effective ways of getting customer acquisition. So in that respect, I think it's actually been a very positive beneficiary in terms of new company formation.
So the observation I would make is that traditionally we've measured the success of an industry by growth in jobs, growth in economic output in the sense of building infrastructure and building out the economy. And the big change in Silicon Valley since the millennium is that now Silicon Valley on a net basis reduces employment in the economy and reduces, as a consequence, investments in infrastructure. And so from a policy point of view, I don't want us to confuse a bull market in venture capital with an economic success. And, again, the history will be written. I think it's too early to know which way this comes down. I think Scott's points are dead on, okay? And I don't disagree with a single thing he just said. I just think that the issues we're facing here are broader and that we have to, we need a Moore's Law in Silicon Valley about investing in industries that create jobs. We really need the next big thing to be human-driven technology, things that actually protect privacy, protect security. You need different models than advertising because the problem here is that at the scale these guys operate, it's about really behavior modification more than anything else. And that's just not healthy for the citizenry or the economy, and that's the concern that really drives me. And the interesting thing is, because I believe these guys violate antitrust law, that is the most pro-growth way of addressing the problems that I see across the broad set of things these companies are doing.
One thing I would note is I'm going to sit in the middle between, figuratively, between Scott and Roger. I do see value in the advertising that these companies provide. I am a huge believer and a personal beneficiary of the possibility of the internet to enable very narrow niche businesses that can reach all over the world. That's literally what my business is. And I think that Facebook ads in particular, and Google ads as well, allow companies that could not have existed previously that are great for the businesses and also great for consumers that get products that are actually tailored to what they want. I think the thing that I would push back on Scott is he correctly articulated the value these provide. The problem is there's only two of them. I don't think that these channels would fail to exist had Facebook not acquired Instagram, for example. I think there would, instead of being two, I actually think there would be four. Because if Instagram was an independent entity, advertisers would be forced to diversify and would also go to Snapchat, for example. My concern is, I believe in the model. I think it's important for the economy, but I worry the fact that there's only two places to go.
Yeah, well said. Well said.
So, Steve, I think this is kind of to your point about multi-homing and there's nothing new under the sun, and that we've seen all this before, and it's a cycle. You're going to get it again. How do you react to the idea that we've had Google for a while and we haven't seen something different, and people kind of may smirk at the alternatives as not being realistic, but how do you square that kind of actual experience with your comments about multi-homing actually being a source of allowing other platforms to become developed?
So, using the search engine as an example, I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago that I made a bona fide attempt to play with Bing, and it was inferior. So I don't care that there's only Google, because 99 out of 100 times when I'm searching for something, I find it on page 1. And that's all I care about as a consumer of search. Now let me go to the other side of advertising. There seems to be a lot of concern that, there are only two. Well, there's the theory of Bertrand competition, where two is enough to get perfect competition under certain circumstances. But more importantly, remember the pricing model of ads on Facebook and Google. Facebook and Google do not set prices for advertising. Advertisers bid on advertising space. And we know that in markets where people have somewhat rational expectations and an understanding of the market they participate in, then when multiple people bid on a certain item, it will go to the person or the entity that has the highest value. So we are achieving economic efficiency. Now, I want to make it very clear that I agree with Roger that the world is not just about efficiency, right? I live in San Francisco. I would happily have my taxes go up by 5 or 10%, which is a lot of money, if government would promise me they're going to solve the homeless problem, because it aches me every time I see that, okay? That's not an antitrust issue. Employment is not an antitrust issue. And I think it's very important that as policymakers and regulators, we understand that there are a lot of things we'd like to see in the world made better. Antitrust is not the panacea of solving all problems.
Roger, I don't know if you want to respond to this kind of idea that, you know, the antitrust laws are dedicated to ensuring that competition is strong to the benefit of consumers. And there might be a whole host of other social ills that need to be protected. But is that a separate issue, one that?
Well, so my point is, I think no matter how you look at it, I believe there are antitrust violations here. And I happen to have, while I believe it would be really helpful to control the growth of these companies, my preference would be of the myriad ways you could regulate them. I would like to start with antitrust and run that thread through, because I believe for the economy as a whole, for venture capital, for startup formation, it is by far the most attractive option. And the set of issues that we see on the antitrust side are very easy to understand once you look at data as a currency. And so my work now is attempting to create that into a unified model that we can apply to antitrust. So I strongly agree with what everybody said, what Steve just said a moment ago, because that's demonstrably true, but I don't think it eliminates the antitrust issues that are here. And the reason I'm here and not at some other agency right now is because I think this is the place I'd like to start of the 10 places where I think they're in violation of the public interest.
So a question from the audience. How do crypto network, this is I think for Ben, how do crypto networks or anybody on the panel fit into the aggregator platform framework? Do you think they can challenge the incumbent networks?
From a theoretical perspective, they're absolutely the antidote to aggregators. I completely agree with Scott. I think the challenge, and remains to be seen, and Andreessen Horowitz has certainly led the way on this, is figuring out what use cases will arise from that. I suspect that to the extent blockchain companies succeed, they're going to be entirely new use cases. I have difficulty seeing a social network built on the blockchain or a search engine built on the blockchain. But from a theoretical perspective, it's absolutely, I agree with Scott.
Another question, how should the FTC identify future competitors to existing dominant firms? How do they know, how can they know what they're looking for? I think, Ben, you mentioned that this was pretty obvious in Silicon Valley or in the VC world that Facebook and Instagram were going to be competitors. What should we just be looking at the models of doing business, or are there other features that we should be focusing on?
Well, I think you have to start with, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I've been talking a lot, please.
So I want to echo something that Scott said that I think is really important, and that is, what is the optimal path of expansion of a potential competitor or some nascent technology? Mm-hmm. Because coming up with good ideas is one thing, and then executing on them is a completely different story. And one of the huge benefits that large platforms bring to the table is execution, because they've already learned how to do that. So when we think about this kind of, M&As of potential competitors, right? If a company would buy them and then execute on that technology to the consumer's benefits, then you have the end result happening a lot faster. If the company would buy them and then take that technology and shelve it, mm-hmm. right, because they don't want to invest in, promoting that competition, then there's that theory of consumer harm. However, given this technology, if that's what, say, Facebook would do with each one of their acquisitions, it would take 4 weeks for someone else to come up with that same idea, because it was out there, get VC funding, wait for Facebook to buy them and shelve them, and then the next one would come up and do that again, right? So I think the end result should be what's happening to consumer welfare. And I think that's the measure stick that we should be using.
Anybody else have any final comments? All right, I think that concludes our panel. Thanks again to the entire panel for being here and for sharing your thoughts.